Yeah. So I want to tell you a little bit about my new book, Kierkegaard for the Church, Essays and Sermons. This is a book I've been working on for about 20 years, so I'm glad to have the opportunity to tell you a little bit about it. It's an unusual book in that it's about this existential philosopher that usually the church doesn't care much about. But this one, Kierkegaard, from Copenhagen, Denmark, back in the 19th century, happened to be involved in the Lutheran Church. So Lutherans have some interest in him, but not many people have actually pursued it. I've been working on it for about 20 years, and this congregation, First Lutheran Church of West Seattle, has been commemorating him every November on his commemoration date for the last 30 years. So we're a little bit out of the ordinary. So I just want to tell you a little bit about the book and what I'm trying to do in it. The whole key to the book is in the title, Kierkegaard for the Church. Kierkegaard, as an existential philosopher, could be just for the academic, the intellectual, talking about whether or not essence really does precede existence or not, which is the existential question in existential philosophy. But he was also very interested in the life of the Christian, very interested in the church. So what I've tried to do is lift up that concern that has not been given a lot of attention. So this book has chapters on prayer, hymn singing, baptism, how to understand the Bible, what the role of the pastor should be. These are concerns of the church that normally aren't thought to be of interest to Kierkegaard, but they were of great interest to him. I even conclude at the end of the book with 7 sermons based on his way of preaching to show how it could actually be used in the congregation. So this book was written for the church. It was written for the educated layperson and for pastors. It could be used at the seminary where ministers are trained. It has an introduction by a leading Lutheran scholar in America, Karl Broughton, and it has an epilogue by the leading Kierkegaard scholar in America down in Florida, Robert Perkins, who called it a high water mark in Kierkegaard research. So I'm very happy about the book, and I just want to tell you a few things about it. But before I get started with that, I want to show you some pictures. I've got a couple pictures in this book as well, and one of them is of Kierkegaard's one of his last known descendants, Anders Stengård from Copenhagen, and he actually received a copy of the book and gave permission to use his picture. Another thing that's really wonderful about this book, another drawing, is a new illustration by a local illustrator, Heather Hudson, on Kierkegaard's fiancée, Regine Olsen, who he broke off the engagement with, and then later saw his writing as his way of pursuing his life with her. And so she made this illustration on how the writing pen was actually Regina in his life. And then the other thing is that along with this whole project is this new statue that we have of Kierkegaard, and there's a picture in the front piece of the book of the statue, so you'd have that too. And Kierkegaard was really quite shy and didn't want any pictures or drawings made of him or any statues, because he said he wanted his writings to be the way he'd be remembered. So on our statue, we actually have one of his statements that I think is one of his best statements about that. He says, "I will seek my refuge with the crucified one to save me from myself." I think that's really probably the most important thing he ever said, and I'll say a little bit more about that as well. So now, just what is it about Kierkegaard? He really wanted the Christian to take the Christian faith more seriously. He was very impressed by the early Christians who, for instance, when a plague would come into town and everybody would leave the town and leave the sick to die, the Christians would stay there and help them because they knew that heaven was their home, and so if they died of the plague, there was something greater waiting for them. So because of their belief in heaven, they could actually stay and work harder on earth than those who didn't have that belief. And he said, what's happened to that? He said, now the church has turned into a club. It's not something that's interesting. They're like dance halls and yodelers, he'd say. And this kind of deep commitment to the Christian faith that enables us to help others and to hold on to this hope of the life to come is lost. It's missing. So he wanted to reintroduce all of that, he said, back into Christianity. And that's what the book is about. That's when we talk about baptism in the Bible and preaching, and we talk about what the pastor's supposed to be, and we're talking about the sermons, and we're talking about how we should deal with our illnesses when we get sick. I have chapters on that. All of it's designed to take the faith more seriously so that you're a stronger servant now and you have this great hope for the life to come. So he worked on that very hard, and he thought he had been given some special gifts. So at one time in his life, for instance, he said he thought that God had given him the ability to write about these things in ways that other people hadn't. And he says this about his books. He said, I've been able to set forth the decisive qualifications of the whole existential arena with a dialectical acuteness and a primitivity not found in any other books. Well, that's a mouthful, but it also gives you kind of a bit of a flavor on how he expresses himself. It's very conceptual and it's very analytic, but you see what he's getting after here. He wants to address these difficult problems of living out the Christian life and do it with an acuteness, a dialectical acuteness, he says, and a primitivity. So what is that about? The dialectical acuteness is looking at both sides of the issue and seeing that every issue has two sides to it, and you need to work them together before you find out what it's really about. And then a primitivity has to do with how does it affect the way I behave? That's what was primitive for him. He didn't want it all just to be a head game. How does it actually change the way I live? So one of the things he really worried about were the failures of the Christian life. And so he talks a lot about that. And he identifies some of the key failures in the Christian life with some detail and wants to work on them. So this is one way he put it. He said, Lord Jesus Christ, this is in a little prayer he puts, our foolish minds are weak, they are more than willing to be drawn, and there is so much that wants to draw us to itself. There is pleasure with its seductive power, the multiplicity with its bewildering distractions, the moment with its infatuating importance, and the conceited laboriousness of busyness, and the careless time-wasting of light-mindedness, and the gloomy brooding of heavy-mindedness. All of this will draw us away from ourselves to itself in order to deceive us. So there it is. There's a list of the things that we need to fight against. We need to fight against the seductive power of pleasure so that our life isn't just about what makes us feel good, but that we're to be concerned about the other person. The infatuating importance of the conceited laboriousness of busyness, where we're just running around doing things that please us rather than looking to the other and what our neighbor needs. And then also the heavy-mindedness of gloomy, brooding attitude, where you become depressed. He said he's not interested in that either. That has to be cleaned out of the Christian life so that we can be servants and help one another. So that's just a little example of what his targets were, of what he was trying to ferret out, what he was trying to clean out in the Christian life. He also felt that this could come about by learning, once again, how to pray correctly. And he had some very wonderful prayers that were really quite startling. But before that, before he writes his prayers, he warns us about praying, that we may take it too superficially. At one point he says, God is in heaven and the human being is on earth, and therefore they can hardly converse. God is infinite wisdom. What the human being knows is idle chatter. Therefore, they can hardly converse. God is love, and the human being, as we say to a child, is a little ninny, even in regard to his own welfare, and therefore they can hardly converse. Only in such fear and trembling is a human being able to speak with God, but such fear and trembling makes speech fall into silence. Now that's a mouthful about prayer. I mean, first of all, it says that we're so different, God and the human is so different, that we can't even talk together. And then secondly, he says, but we need to talk to each other, and when we do, we mostly listen to God rather than talk to him. That is a very different way of construing prayer. So one of his famous prayers says this. This is what the Christian is supposed to say in the prayer. Lord my God, I really have nothing at all for which to pray to you. Even if you would promise to grant me every wish, I really cannot think of anything except that I may remain with you as near as possible in the time of separation in which you and I are living, and entirely with you in all of eternity. So what kind of a prayer is that? Where he says, I have nothing to ask of you. It's a prayer that recognizes the differences and recognizes the hope that is there with a life with God for all of eternity. So, really a different way of construing the Christian life and trying to turn it around so that we then are of some help to our neighbor and also have some confidence in the life to come. He realized that there were these failures, but he wasn't trying to reduce the Christian life to a jumbled mess of questioning and criticism. He had this to say about doubt. He says, doubt in the right way, not to doubt what stands firm and will stand firm forever in its eternal clarity, but to doubt that which in itself is transitory, which will more and more vanish, to doubt himself, his own capacity and competence, so that it becomes an incapacity that is discarded more and more. False doubt doubts everything except itself. With the help of faith, the doubt that saves doubts only itself. Another characteristic statement of his that some people would say, I can't follow. It's kind of convoluted. But what he's saying here is that we should doubt our appropriation of the Christian faith and not what the Christian faith teaches. Unfortunately, in the modern world, we doubt what the Christian faith teaches and think it is not based on anything that's factual or substantial, and we don't doubt our own appropriation of it. But that's what he said we should do, because again, what it's about is trying to transform ourselves. So, Kierkegaard had an image of a spring that he thought, a spring in a watch, that he thought was what he was driving for and wanted the world to know about. This comes from his book on his Christian discourses, and he says, there is so much in the ordinary course of life that will lull a person to sleep, teach him to say peace and no danger, therefore to go to God's house and be awakened from sleep and to be pulled out of the spell. But when in turn there is at times so much in God's house that will lull us to sleep, even that which in itself is awakening, thoughts, reflections, and ideas, can completely lose meaning through the force of habit and monotony, just as a spring can lose the tension by which it alone is really what it is. This is what my book is about, to try to bring that spring, that tension, back to life in the Christian life so that the Christian life is more meaningful. That's why I've spent the last 20 years working on this. That's why I have tried to make this better known to the church and to people in modern life. In closing, I want to say just one thing, further thing about the book is what kind of help then comes from him. This is what I write at the beginning of the book. I write this, and this would be for, if you want to be a prospective reader of the book, those who wonder about the expectations of the Christian life can do no better than read Kierkegaard.